Did you enjoy the film? Yes. Excellent. I knew what the answer to that question was going to be. So we wanted to do a couple of things, thematize some of the topics in the film that probably all of us were thinking about while it was running. But I wanted to also ask a couple of background questions, and then of course we'll open it up to the audience more broadly. So Daniel, congratulations again on this wonderful film.
Thanks.
I'm sure it never gets old to get applause from an appreciative audience.
Thank you.
I think on all of our minds is the question of how did you actually come to make this film? The topic has an intrinsic level of interest, of course, but what drew you to the topic? And perhaps most importantly, how did you get access to these characters coming from the so-called alt-right? And if you could maybe say a little bit about your personal identity and how that might have complicated the process of getting access, that would be interesting.
Well, thanks for doing this. This was really special. It's been about 2 years since I've screened the film, so it was nice to see it again. I'm Jewish. I'm the grandson of 2 Holocaust survivors. My dad's mother is from Nuremberg, and my mom's mother is from a town called Kelsey in Poland. I graduated college and worked and got a job at the Atlantic magazine right out of school. And that was right around when this group called the alt-right was rising. And I think as I was younger and it was just on college campuses, I understood the power that this group had and the way that it was resonating with young people in particular. And working in a newsroom where people were a little bit older, I think that understanding wasn't necessarily there. That, if you can put your mind back in time, Trump was one of 16 presidential candidates. The Huffington Post was covering him in the entertainment section, if you remember that. And I was on Twitter, on Reddit, and even 4chan a bit, which no one should ever go on 4chan except for academics. And I just saw how much momentum this group had and how really disgusting, anti-Semitic, racist they were. So I said to my boss and eventually to Jeff Goldberg, who's the editor of the Atlantic, he had just taken over. I called this guy called Richard Spencer. You've probably never heard of him. But he invited me to come to this conference. So I went to that conference, and at that conference, he yelled, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory," and broke out into a salute. And that made international news. It was seen, I think, 50 million times around the world. You think he would cut me off after that? He should have cut me off. But he started kind of leaning on me as a kind of therapist. And then I met Mike, and Lauren was the hardest one. Lauren took about 8 months. But I just kept showing up, and eventually, they came to kind of lean on me in a way which is strange and probably wasn't wise on their part.
And so trust issues, given their knowledge or lack thereof in terms of your background, how did that complicate the process?
My last name is Lombroso, which is a Sephardic last name, but people assume I'm Italian or Spanish. So I usually buy myself 1 or 2 shoots before someone is what are you? And actually, this is all coming back because I shot a lot of these scenes were 6 years ago in Florida when Richard gives that big speech and gets booed off stage. We went on a long road trip together to get to the speech. It was 4 hours in the car, and we ran out of. He was playing Depeche Mode and weird music, and then asking me about. And then finally said, "So tell me more about your Italian ancestry." And we were a year into the project. I said, "Actually, I'm Jewish. My dad's from Israel. Whatever." And he was shocked and didn't know what to say. He certainly met Jews before, but he didn't know what to say. But the driver was a local kind of skinhead, and I just remember him clutching the wheel and watching me the whole rest of the ride. And then the car actually broke down, and we got stuck at a gas station for 5 hours. It was not a pleasant time. But it's really in documentary filmmaking, it's just about showing up and building that trust and treating the story with some integrity. I wanted to do that, to treat it with some empathy and some open-mindedness.
Thank you. So Anna, let me turn to you for a second here. As an American historian with a specialization in African-American history, as well as a focus on the history of white supremacy, you're uniquely qualified to sort of approach this topic from a historian's perspective, but you also have a personal connection to one of the cities mentioned in the film, that is Charlottesville. So I wanted to ask you, in your experience, you were probably already interested in this topic, but in the 2017 Unite the Right controversy during that period, how did that shape some of your approach to this broader topic?
Sure. So thanks everyone for being here this evening. And I will say, the minute we started talking, I was like, oh, it makes sense. You're very easy to talk to. I mean, he has a good documentary ethos that I was like, I can totally understand how they all spent so much time with Daniel.
Thank you.
So to the question, so I first dove into my research. I've been interested in the history of Black anti-fascism for about a decade now. And so I will say the research and the political mood of the United States and Europe kind of melded together. I initially thought my work was going to be a history of the Black left, but at a certain point you become interested in the right, and so I started working in a lot of archives of the American right, and oftentimes looking at the records of organizations that infiltrated far-right groups in U.S. history, and there's a ton of amazing collections in that regard. So that was kind of one thing. Then, I'm from Charlottesville, and being a resident, and I had a lot of friends who were living in Charlottesville in 2016, 2017. Encounters with the Confederate statues that peppered that landscape were very important to my interest in history and my interest in counter histories of white supremacy. And so I was interested, right, when initially a high school freshman named Ziona Bryant filed the petition, not the first petition, but a sort of timely petition to get the Confederate statues torn down. That was in 2016, right? And then the main thing was, it was in May of 2017 was when Spencer sort of first did a sort of small torchlight rally in Charlottesville, and that was kind of when it was initially on my radar. And like you, I was kind of coming of intellectual and political age as the alt-right was coming into formation. You know, I had heard the stories, friends of friends who had been push toward, Holocaust denial content on YouTube from the algorithm. There was, people saying, oh, don't go to that bar in Greenpoint because it's where the Proud Boys hang out. Like, it had been in my world, but then suddenly it was in my intimate world. And so most folks, know about August 11th and 12th of 2017, but there had been a series of rallies centered around the statues. There was the one in May. There was a Klan demonstration. The Virginia, North Carolina Klans rallied in Charlottesville that July at the same site. So I had been there for all of that and been sort of bearing witness to that. And I think in terms of how, bearing witness to August 11th and 12th in Charlottesville was one of the most impactful things that's ever happened to me, like on so many levels. But I think in terms of my research, what was most stunning was is counter to the shock that a lot of people felt, the sense that this came out of nowhere, a sort of New York Times push notification at midday, or even a shock that it was an aberration, because the main thing, sort of the image, the tangle of all those different banners, American flags, Confederate flags, Viking iconography, swastikas, right, all of that. I had been studying similar, you might think of it as sort of right-wing united fronts, spanning back a century. So in some ways, it was a kind of affirmation of a deep political, grassroots, sort of right-wing organizing tradition that I had been seeing in my research, and seeing, then left-wing anti-fascist groups infiltrating for about 100 years. So it was galvanizing, and I think I sort of said, I want to write a history that can explain why neo-Nazis care about Robert E. Lee, but it wasn't sort of like a new insight. It sort of confirmed various coalitions and organizing traditions that I'd been familiar with in the archive.
Thank you. So let me turn to a couple of thematic questions before we open it up to audience Q&A. Obviously, Daniel, there's some amazing character profiles in this film. And I think one of the interesting things about a Lauren Southern or Richard Spencer or Mike Cernovich is that some of the contradictions within the alt-right come to the fore fairly clearly. And I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on this topic. So maybe, Anna, if I can turn to you first. One of the contradictions obviously involves gender, and the contradiction of someone like Lauren Southern, who's trying to fit into a movement that wants women to be subservient to men. Certainly the Gavin McInnes coverage in the film makes that clear. How do women like Lauren Southern and some of the other female right-wing YouTubers that are portrayed in the film, how do they navigate that contradiction? Or maybe from a historical perspective, what could you say about the role of gender in the far right that might make it clear how some of these women are trying to do two things that are maybe mutually exclusive?
I mean, in simplest terms, there is just a deep historical precedent to it, right? And I think, I will say, and something I'd love for all of us to talk about more, is how ahistorical they all seem to be, and how not only lacking historical knowledge to back up their claims, but also thinking they're the first to do the things they're doing, right? So when Lauren Southern was talking, I kept on thinking of the notorious conservative activist and attorney Phyllis Schlafly, right, who very famously, in fighting against the ERA, would often begin her speeches with, "I'd like to thank my husband Fred for letting me be here today." but she then later said, well, I only say that because it makes the women's livers mad, right? So she was an extremely well-educated, highly accomplished, powerful individual. And so even in that regard, she is leaning into the contradiction, right? Because she knows it's the scandal. She knows she's trolling. So I think the main thing is there's no resolving the contradiction. And I thought some of the saddest parts of the documentary were these moments she's really, like that phone call in the car is so it's so sad. And I think, or her discomfort at the end when asked to reflect on the obvious contradiction of her personal life conflicting with a public ideology. So I don't think there's no resolving the contradiction. I think the documentary really powerfully just exposed it and asked us all to sit with it. But at the same time, there have been white women involved in far-right organizing forever. And there are really interesting ways historically where white women have used their unique positions, the kinds of jobs they do, fighting, school desegregation. One of the major battlegrounds was PTAs, right? Who's on parent-teacher associations, right? So again, a moment where I was overwhelmed by how much of a legacy there was, and the two things that were sad were, one, that Lauren Southern didn't seem to be aware, in some respects, that she's part of a long legacy, but two, the contradiction's always been there, and to me, it's just, it's worthy of deeper reflection. And I saw moments, the last thing I'll say, a great strength, these moments where you show in her like a crack, right? Maybe where she's the only one I sort of truly believed was digging deeper.
And that brings us to the question of the second contradiction around race. So, perfect segue. The fact that early in the film you see Ollie Alexander, doesn't seem to know how to spell Halloween, but okay. And then you've got Mike Cernovich's wife being Persian, or as she says it, secular Muslim Iranian. And then, of course, at the end, as Anna was just alluding to, the relationship between Lauren Southern and her quote-unquote non-white boyfriend slash fiancé. Without getting into academies and phrases about things like multiracial whiteness, which has been a phrase floated in recent years, is it possible for non-whites, quote-unquote, to embrace white supremacy and to sort of buy into this idea of the alt-right defending Western civilization, white civilization, even if they themselves are not coming from that background, let alone the question of the advocates for white nationalism being involved romantically with people who are not white?
Anna could talk about the historical roots, but I mean, everyone is willing to make exceptions for people that they like, and I think it's just that, in the same way that they were making an exception for me as a Jewish filmmaker with them. Mm-hmm. Mike, I think, loved Shauna, who happened to be Persian, and Lauren actually married her bodyguard, and I think it's something I wasn't able to disclose in the film, but then I ended up writing a big story in The Atlantic. And I think there's interesting symbolism that she was harassed and actually assaulted by Gavin McInnes. So I wrote a big Atlantic story when the film came out that goes into what Gavin did. And then ends up with her bodyguard, who happens to be Asian Australian, and she has a mixed race kid with him. So yeah, I mean, I think it's anyone can be an ideologue, and it's a lot harder to live that in practice. And I think also, like, tokens have a role. I mean, when you put on Fox News or anything, there's always a person, and we see that all the time where people want to associate with an idea and they say, look, even X friend agrees with me. So the alt-right, I think, sees that utility, because if they're just looking for the pure definition of whiteness, especially the historical, I know you want to get into the historical one, which wouldn't include Italians and definitely would not include Slavs and certainly not Jews, there's not that many. So they need to expand the definition, and Richard has expanded it to Italians and Slavs and not Jews, but maybe one day, I don't know, Arabs or something. They need enough people to make this happen.
Yeah. Which raises the final question, which maybe you can just say something briefly about, Anna and Daniel, and that is the question of whether this alt-right, at the time that you did the film, and maybe what we would call the alt-right today, is it ultimately something that's driven by ideology or by opportunism? Clearly Richard Spencer is disrespecting, if you will, Mike Cernovich as a grifter, but clearly all of them are trying to make money at the same time that they're allegedly committed to ideas. So maybe, Anne, if you wanted to either tackle that or the question of the racial contradictions that Daniel was just referring to, but maybe if you can just weigh in on the ideology versus opportunism, and then we'll open it up.
The annoying historian's answer is both, always. But it's true, and you know, I think, but to kind of relating the two together, neither identity nor ideology are stable categories. They're pliable, and political language is ungovernable, and people take up terms and make meaning of them on their own. They make exceptions. They seek out tokens that can affirm that they're not racist. They say that moment when he's like, Western, not white, you know? And there were so many contradictions embedded in the movie that I think, so one, it's both. Two, I think there's also something to be said about you know, there's always been this sort of antagonizing trolling culture, but there is, even as this is a long history, there's a uniqueness to this movie in the particular impulse to troll, to get the soundbite, right? So I think the opportunism is very distinct in that regard, rooted in social media, rooted in a very particular kind of 2008 to 2016 culture, but ultimately it's both, and we can get more into it in the Q&A.
Daniel, any comment on that before we open it up?
I guess the last thing I'd add is how nostalgic it feels for me to watch the film, probably both because I was there, but also how much our politics have evolved. You know, when I was making the film, these things felt on the fringe. I mean, Richard's whole idea is that over time things change, that gay marriage was once on the fringe and now is in the mainstream. And it's not that anyone is calling for, it's not that Republicans are calling for a white ethno-state explicitly the way that Richard is, but the conservative movement has certainly embraced a lot of the ideas that someone like a Mike Cernovich or a Lauren Southern says openly on their channel. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, and even the internet culture and the way things work feel very 2016 or 2018. So our politics have evolved a lot, and a lot of these ideas are in the mainstream of the conservative movement now. They're on Fox News, they're on Truth Social. And I think in the upcoming election, we'll see just how resonant they are.
Thank you. So we don't have to work with note cards tonight. We can simply pass the microphone to anyone in the audience that would like to ask a question, either of Daniel or Anna. Questions? Yes, there in the middle. Oh, I think a microphone's coming your way, or you, okay, we could just let her rip.
Rather than ethnic issues or racial issues, because there were even blacks in the crowd. I don't know if you can say that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what the two of you think, but I think Western is a euphemism for white in this case. I mean, they're not, I mean, just because they have a few people around doesn't mean that those people would be allowed in the community that they want. And Richard is the most explicit, but that's also why he's the most marginal at the end and is living in his mom's basement, you know? And part of the power of Lauren and Mike is that they're able to obscure things just enough. And that's why someone like Lauren looks to Europe. It's because Europe is the center of whiteness, and you know, we're seeing all these parties in Europe do really well on the far right, and you know, they're talking pretty explicitly about expelling Moroccans and you know, Middle Easterners of all kinds. So in my mind, it's about whiteness.
Yeah, I'll say similarly. I think, yeah, Lauren's draw to Lauren. We don't know her. Lauren, Lauren Southern's draw to Europe is similarly right. There is an ultimate. There's something they have to sort of put the melting pot on the back burner, so to speak, and be drawn toward Europe as a place where they can say, here are distinct nations filled with distinct white peoples who speak French in France. There are French people in France, and I have a really clear delineation of who's French and who's not. And that even as they talk in terms of French culture, there is something buried under that, and it is a racially exclusionary logic. And I think, you know, there's much more to get into it, but I think this film was also a really good reminder of how much Islamophobia as this really central engine, it needs to be part of that particular moment too, and kind of setting all of this off. And again, why Europe becomes where she makes this film, rather than, you know, the U.S.-Mexico border, for instance.
And the migrant crisis, yeah.
I do wonder whether, though, there is a difference between the American far right and the European far right, only for the following reason. We do know today that there are people like Enrico Tarrio, like Nick Fuentes, like Ali Alexander, who are demonstrably non-white from non-European backgrounds, who are nevertheless virulent white nationalists, racists, in the case of Nick Fuentes, an avowed Nazi. That is unimaginable in certainly Germany in the 1930s, despite the fact that there were some far-right German Jews who wanted to be accepted by the Nazis. That was never possible. And because there is this tradition in America where new immigrant groups can assimilate by becoming racist, I think just of like the Catholic Front in the 1930s, which, you know, basically imitated the Klan. I mean, it was called the Catholic Klan for, you know, for a variety of different reasons. But if one way to maybe embrace whiteness in America is to embrace white racism, even if you're not white yourself, if that's the requirement for acceptance, maybe that's something that's possible in America in a way that it's not possible in some of the ethnically rooted nation states of Europe, which is maybe why some people would look at the alt-right and say, this is not serious, this is not a serious movement, because there's no ideological consistency, and Hitler wouldn't have let any Jew be, you know, in the top ranks of his movement. And we of course know that when Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA, was exposed as openly gay, which ran counter to the Nazi ethos on heterosexuality, he was murdered. There were other reasons as well, but that doesn't seem, at least in the present day, far right in America to be taking place. So that does shed light on the difference between culture, ethnicity, and race. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of opportunistic blurring of those boundaries, and it's worth, of course, being attentive to that. Any other questions from, yes, please.
Thank you. I don't think a day goes by that I don't see some story that there's some event like this somewhere in the world. This is not a local problem here in this country. It's all over. But based on that, there were so many variables in the system. How are we ever going to get out of this? You have any ideas? Because I don't.
That's a tough one. You know, I think part of it is that this ideology is seductive. It gives kids a sense of belonging at its core. Like when I went to these events, I felt like I was part of a community. Not that I took part in it, but I felt what the other kids felt, and that they were dressing in the same way and speaking the same things, and, you know, in the same group chats and WhatsApp groups and whatever. And I think, you know, there is a real problem in this country of kids feeling lost and depressed and struggling with anxiety and not knowing who they are and what their identity is. And here comes this Richard Spencer on YouTube reaching millions of people saying, you're not a bored, lost kid, you're actually a Roman or a Greek, which I'm sure is totally ahistorical, but whatever. And you're home in Pennsylvania and you're bored working at 7-Eleven. That sounds way more tantalizing, that I'm the descendant of, you know, a Roman general. So I think this is like the weirdest solution, but I think we have to find other ways of engaging young people in community, whether it's like a metal group, whatever it is, like just finding ways that young kids are engaged and understand that, you know, that hate is not the answer.
And I have a kind of long-term answer to that, and then a sort of more practical, maybe cynical answer. The long-term is sort of like, embedded in that sad story Cernovich told about his mother, and that the conclusion he as a child took from it is you can't trust anybody, and this like isolated individualism, and so the answer is sort of cultivate more spaces where someone's conclusion is in fact, oh, the answer is to build community, right? Whether it's, you know, I feel like I could sort of wax nostalgic about a sort of popular front moment, but cultivate spaces where people who are different from one another encounter one another, literal public spaces, unions, right? These places that at times you would be poised to meet someone who was different than you. And not in a sort of structured, like, listening and learning meet and greet way, but just sort of civil society. The more cynical answer is sometimes I just really hope the kind of libertarian impulses in American life win out, the sort of like, you do you, I do me, right? And I think that is something I do take comfort in sometimes is, you know, I spend a lot of time in parts of, you know, we're in the sort of realm of coastal elites right now, but spending time in the Midwest, in the Deep South with conservative communities, conservative family, and so often it's just like, okay, you do you, right? And so I sort of an impulse of people to just let each other be. Sometimes that's all I can hope for, at least for now.
There's a question here in the front.
People don't feel they're biased or being, accused of things. But I also was taken by that statement that he made about his mother. And there's, throughout this, they trusted you. You said you felt like a therapist. They needed therapists. A lot of people need a therapist. And I mean that in the sense of relationships, role models, that empathy. If you don't have that in educational systems, after-school program, people become very deranged or distorted, or they're very alone, and so and it was now, of course, with all of AI and social media, it's very dystopic. Because kids, they're very, very susceptible to this. But I think that was true. He needed a therapist, and he actually probably benefited from his relationship with you. You got to have people connect with one another.
Yeah. I've had that. I do a lot of. First of all, I agree with I've never had a question comment that I've agreed with more. I agree with every part of that. I do a lot of work on far-right figures, and what I say in documentary pitch meetings, influential bad guys are sort of like my specialty, and I get them to trust me. And I have a new film about the Southern Baptist Convention, and this pastor led an effort to ban women in leadership positions this year at it's the largest evangelical conference in the country, and they voted to ban women in all leadership positions. And the man who led the effort had never done press before. He's actually half Arab himself, which is gets back to this whole thing. And, I started with him, and then I met his wife, and then I met his 18 grandchildren, and finally he said, come to Florida. And the last day we got very, very close. I spent weeks with him, and the last day he said, Daniel, I need to know, do you like me? And that, every time I do this sort of exercise, that happens. I think you're right. People want to feel connection, and they start to feel very connected to me. And then I treat them with a lot of empathy. I really think it's fair to them, but it's still hard for them to see it. And unfortunately, Mike saw the film and didn't like it very much. But I think I captured who he is.
So I think we have time for one more question before we can go out into the Great Hall. And if you want to check out Fascism in America, Janet Ward and I will be there to answer any questions. Yes, question in the middle.
I was really struck by there's a quote that Mike had where he was like, I don't care if you do the salute, but you have to control your people, which kind of gives a sense of, do your Nazi salutes like when you're together when cameras aren't rolling, which brings me to my question, because you mentioned the kind of road trip. As someone who is also a psychologist, speaking to the last question, someone who's very interested in psychology, especially the psychology of alt-right figures, what was it like when the cameras weren't rolling? And then this question can also go to everyone else as far as alt-right when the camera isn't rolling. So I'd be curious to hear more about that behind the scenes kind of place that you held.
I mean, you can really see the sadness and feel the sadness in them, and that was my challenge as a filmmaker, was to capture moments that people don't want seen on film, because everyone wants to project themselves at their most confident. So when you meet them in Act 1, Mike Cernovich is on top of the world. He says he's going to be a household name, and Lauren Southern is she says the Libyan Ocean. It's the Mediterranean Sea. And whatever. But over time, that's the beauty of what you call verite filmmaking, where you just hang out with people, is eventually everyone reveals themselves. It's just spending enough time. And you start to get glimpses, probably 6 or 7 months into me knowing them. When Lauren's on the date, we use, at the Atlantic, we used to call it the date from hell, with the guy who's telling her that she has to be a mother. He actually He actually refused to eat ketchup that meal because he said ketchup is from China originally. It's called catsup. It's like a fish sauce. I don't know. He only eats white food. I don't understand. Could not. He actually, in another moment, I know people love all these tidbits, is like after spending a week with him, he turned to me and he's like, it must be really stressful for you to be a Jew here doing this. I was like, well, don't be such an asshole. It wouldn't be a problem, you know? And my last thing there is he actually did a 23andMe and found out that he's 2% Ashkenazi Jewish, if you remember that. And he could not get over it.
Who isn't these days, right?
But the short answer is that the sadness like had no bottom, and like eventually you see it. And I think the best one is Mike in his car at the end. He admits that he wakes up and he hates himself, and I think a lot of them feel that way.
Please join me in congratulating Daniel Lombroso on a great film.